Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our latest live event here with Scottish Autism. I'm delighted, absolutely delighted to have Jo Wells with us this afternoon. Some of you may know Jo, who's recently performing at the Edinburgh Fringe. So welcome, Jo. Thank you for joining us.
Hello,
Really
thanks for having
appreciate
me.
your time. I know you're a super busy man at the moment with your show I Am Autistic at the Edinburgh Fringe. And you were just saying there, it's you're performing every day. At
Yes,
the
yeah, doing
Fringe.
full run. Last show on this Sunday, so
Yeah.
only a few shows left.
So we've quite no, I think you're entitled to feel a bit tired at this stage because that's quite an undertaking. A live show every day. So I really appreciate you giving us some of your time to come and chat to us this afternoon. So thank you. So Jo, you're a comedian and a writer. And I've had the opportunity to read some of your stuff, and I've seen some of your stand-up comedy. Absolutely hilarious. I was talking to colleagues earlier, we were in hysterics watching some of it. It's absolutely brilliant. So what drew you to, from your kind of early sort of writing career? I believe you started to write around about 14, 15, is that right? And kind of writing and then into comedy. So can you tell us a bit about that journey?
Yeah, well, I suppose I when I was young, very young, I'd often get bad grades in English. Yeah, I think the grading system is probably different now, but I remember it when I was year six. I my grade was given like it was something like 3, 4, 5. Those were like the three sort of boxes you could be in, and my writing was so bad that it went into like the lower grade, which no one else is like. It's like groundbreakingly bad writing. um, but yeah, so I always found writing quite tricky. But then writing funny stuff I really liked, and I was quite interested in comedy and jokes. I think possibly, and I think this is maybe a sort of a bit of a generalization, but possibly that sort of systemizing brain. I think jokes are often like sort of puzzles where you go, if a lot of the time a joke is a sentence where you have a piece of information out of the sentence that you hold till the end. And usually you would put that piece of information at the beginning of the sentence, but if you find a way that you can structure it the other way, then it works as a joke because it sort of reveals something, that sort of thing. So I think that sort of funny stuff appealed to my quite systemizing brain. So when I was young, I found English quite hard because I think the sort of way you're taught to write is, just sort of open up and all the writing will flow out of you. But I was quite, and no, very few people agree with me on this, but I really you often see things where people get annoyed that children are taught about like different sentence clauses and stuff like that. But when we learnt that at school, I was really fascinated by that, by the way that like the same sentence, you could structure it in a different way and it could mean something else. So when we started looking at writing in a sort of more mechanical way, I was really fascinated by that. And yeah, so then I was into writing. I had very severe OCD when I was a teenager, so I wrote a book about that. I was writing about that, and my mum shared it with a publisher, and they took me up on it, and I got a book contract. And then I was watching lots of comedy, got an open spot when I was 18. And yeah, did some comedy. I was really into political comedy. I think I was quite what would the word be? But well, quite an unhappy teenager, and I think that political comedy appealed to me. I saw people like Mark Thomas, and they were very angry and sort of railing against something, and I think I was yeah, and that sort of appealed to me. The idea of sort of being able to go out and shout about stuff and people appreciating it.
Yeah, yeah. And it's just really interesting, as I say, in my kind of journey, looking at your work and the books that you've written. Obviously, you wrote your book on it, on having OCD and what that felt like to you as a relatively young man, as a teenager. And forgive me, and hopefully I have understood this correctly, but you didn't get your autism diagnosis until a bit later on, is that right?
Yes, it's a bit complicated because when I was going through the OCD stuff, it was obviously evident to everyone apart from me, and the therapist I was seeing recommended that I was put forward for a diagnosis of what would have then been called Asperger's. And there's two versions of events. So I don't remember this conversation being had with me, but maybe it was had with me. My parents weren't keen on it, and apparently I didn't want to go forward for that diagnosis as well. But I don't remember that conversation being had. But I think that what we understand by the word autism now is very different to, we were talking early noughties, maybe 2005, around that time, So like there were a few, some people know people like Donna Williams and those sort of writers who were writing stuff that was coming from a sort of, what became like the neurodiversity movement. But broadly speaking, the conversation around autism then was, this is a thing that is wrong with people. That was the conversation that was prevalent at the time. So I think like, that for better or worse, my parents didn't want to sort of label another thing that was wrong with me. As an adult, I worked in what's referred to as SEND for 5 years. Met lots of young autistic people. They would do things that I did. They are often, I found things like the way that some of the young autistic people were perceived by the neurotypical staff members. I'd often find like that I sort of like was like, no, don't you understand what they're like? I felt like neurotypical staff members were confused by what young people were trying to say. And I was like, well, no, they're being really clear. Like, and I sort of felt like, and so I felt like, well, there are lots of stuff they say that I could relate to, particularly when I was a child. I also found my mum told me about the conversations that were had around diagnosis when I was a young child. And another amazing fact, and it's incredible that I didn't put everything together and it only sort of was that my mum, and I do remember this, but I sort of thought it was a hobby my mum had. My mum used to run a support group for parents of autistic children, and looking back, that should have been a big clue that that was why she did that. So then I found that was 4 years ago. I found that went through the diagnosis process, and it all made a lot of sense. In fact, if you read the book I wrote when I was a teenager, there's stuff in that. There's one particular chapter where you go, of course, like he's writing about how he finds eye contact really difficult and how he finds social situation, and like sort of really textbook stuff. But I think with the OCD, I also had the narrative of it was OCD was very debilitating, I guess. Of it, was a horrible experience to go through, and I had some very good therapy that helped with that. But it meant that there's a good chunk of my childhood where all my time was spent counting things, tapping things, doing all these sorts of things. So I think the narrative I had was, that's why I find social things difficult, because I had, at least 3 years, probably more, where I wasn't thinking about making friends. I wasn't learning how to make friends. I was, doing all the time-consuming OCD stuff. So that was, a narrative I sort of had for myself. But then when the sort of autism stuff came around, I was like, oh no, that's what it is. It's been that the whole time. And I think also the writing around autism and that like is. I read, you'll know Elle McNichol, being from Scotland, won't you? So I read her book immediately after reading another very popular book, not written by an autistic person, but about an autistic child. And the sort of the difference between those books is so stark. And I read the one not written by an autistic person. I thought, well, I was reading that going, oh, maybe I'm not autistic, because this is nothing like me. I can't relate to this in any way, And then I read Elle McNichol's book. I was like, oh no, yeah, this is speaking to, even though it's speaking to an experience which is different to mine, it's still speaking to an autistic experience, which is very relatable. So I think that a lot of the writing and stuff, the YouTube stuff, the comedy stuff, all those sorts of things that's coming through from autistic people, I think is sort of carving out a more authentic picture of what it is to be Autistic, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Dara McAnulty's book, I think, is another example of that, you know, where you get it's a very real example of that experience, you know, which you know, some what's that drama about the autistic doctor, you know, that I don't relate to that at all. I forget, is it called The Good Doctor, something like that?
Yes.
Yeah, you know, I watched that and I don't relate to
Yeah.
that at all, but you're reading something like Dara's book, you know, you go, oh, that's incredibly relatable. So I think the that sort of well, the Twitter hashtag's actually autistic, isn't it? That sort of writing coming through, I think, has was very helpful to me, of going, oh yeah, that's what I am.
Yeah. And I think there'll be a lot of people watching this, maybe they'll come and watch it later on, that will, you know, I suppose what you're saying will speak to them in the sense of, you know, that childhood experience and how that, you know, has influenced your life going forward. And, you know, that and we hear a lot from autistic people and their families saying, well, you know, this person does this or reacts in this way. Is that because of this, or is that because of that? And it's, you know, I suppose sometimes it's not always possible to unpick those sorts of things specific to whether it's the OCD or the autism or what it might, whatever, you know, that diagnostic, you know, kind of identity is there. But actually, these are all things that are all sort of interlacing with one another. They're all part of who you are or who that person is, and actually, you know, listening and being able to appreciate other people's experiences and other people's stories is actually really, really helpful in trying, you know, in that process of finding your own identity and your own story, and being the owner of your story, if you like, rather than that being belonging to other people who are, you know, making decisions or, you know, forming opinions, like you said, you know, the kind of neurotypical, you know, teaching staff, you know, forming opinions about something that actually, you know, they don't have, you know, the same level of insight that you do, or the same level of connection to that experience that you do. So yeah, I think a lot of people will find that really helpful. I have a couple of questions for you already, Joe, if that's all right,
of course, yeah.
To ask them. So I've got Peter here. Hi, Peter. So Peter writes, do you feel there is something like an autistic sense of humour, perhaps enjoying making something social a little awkward and then leaning into it for a little too long? I'm interested in whether there's autistic cultural creativity that's distinct from, and he uses the term, you know, neurotypical kind of comedy, if you like.
Yeah, I think I certainly think there is a neurotypical sense of humor that I think is a very specific thing that and I think this is maybe part of the reason that sort of stereotype of autistic people not understanding humor comes from. I think I would often see neurotypical people sort of make jokes in sort of bantery way that is more about like sort of a social like connection than actually the jokes being funny. I don't know if it's partly because I'm a comedian, so I know lots of all my friends are comedians, so we have better jokes. But a time which really made me think, I went to get my car fixed, and in the like the office, there's like 3 people who work, but mechanics there, and they're getting bordering in new uniforms, and one person's sat at the desk, and he's very like small and skinny. And one of the other mechanics goes, oh, we'll order a new jumper for you. Was it 3XL? And they're all laughing at 3XL. And then they go, oh, we'll just check the label. Oh, it says 3XL in your label. And that sort of goes on for a good sort of few minutes of like, they're sort of like pretending like, oh, we're going to order, you know, you must be 3XL, even though it's very skinny. And like, like, I think that was the sort of humor which I didn't connect with. But I would argue that's not a funny joke. But I think it's like, yeah, I mean, you couldn't do that on stage and just go out and tell that as a story. But I think that there's this sort of like, I don't know, sometimes I sometimes see sort of neurotypical people communicating in that way that feels like it's more like a sort of, it's like the small talk version of comedy, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, that's bit, and it's probably more seated in, I suppose, taking the mick. You know,
yeah, it's sort of like we're all friends. There's nothing, you know. We're sort of like, Yeah, so but it's like like it's not about this. Here's a good joke I've written, or
Mm-hmm.
here's a sort of clever, funny thing. It's like we're, we're sort of we're all mates, we're all friends.
Mm-hmm.
This is about our relationship rather than the things I'm saying being funny,
Mm-hmm.
and that feels like a very neurotypical thing
Mm-hmm. That's
to me,
interesting.
anyway.
That's interesting. No, hopefully that answered your question there, Peter. I've got another question here from Katrina. I hope I've pronounced that right. Catriona, who asks, what difference has it made to you having that diagnosis, as opposed to just, sort of knowing it in yourself? Like, what difference, I suppose what she's asking there is, did having that I suppose piece of paper, if you like, that said, yes, you are autistic, what difference did that make as opposed to the kind of identity? Because I think they're two very different things, aren't they?
Yeah, definitely. And to be honest, I wish it. I think the fact that it did make a difference is something that I need to work on, because I think the most important thing is that sort of how you see yourself, and like no, and actually, I think the process by which I was assessed, is incredibly flawed. I was asked whether I prefer to go to museums or theatres, and I can't remember which the sort of autistic answer is, but it's that's like just a ridiculous question to ask, or museums or theatres, and so I think that sort of formal process feels very flawed. I was working up a show about it whilst I was going through the diagnosis process, and when I had that formal diagnosis, I felt like I could say things that I couldn't say before, and I felt like I was able to. But the fact that I felt more confident to speak on it after having that formal diagnosis, which I think is a very gate-kept thing, and where there are groups of people who it is harder for them to get a diagnosis. I am in many ways in some of the groups that where it's easier to get that diagnosis. Certainly when I speak, I mean, obviously, be like, sort of female friends of mine. I talked to on our pod. I talked to Rialina, who's a Asian woman comedian, and her process of getting a diagnosis was so different to mine, and there was so much sort of skepticism, even though in many ways I think Ria sort of fits the sort of strict diagnosis much more neatly than I do. This is someone who has a doctorate in science, and is so I think the fact that there are these the process of who gets a diagnosis and who doesn't has a bias towards certain groups. I did feel more confident talking on the topic after having a formal diagnosis, but I think the fact that I did is problematic.
It's a process that we need to work harder at, isn't it? So that everybody should have free and equal access to get a diagnosis if they want it, and do need to work harder at that. So
and I think we need to think about what that process is as well, because I think some of the questions people are asked, I just don't think I think the question about theatres and museums, I don't believe that's relevant to being autistic or not. I think there's loads of, I mean, I'm at the Edinburgh Fringe. There's loads of theatre goers in Edinburgh who, people I know who are autistic and at their most happy sat watching a theatre show, but have no interest in going to museums. And I think that the whole process of assessment needs to be sort of rethought how that works, because I think it feels very flawed and feels very, very biased to me.
And it's sort of creating these I don't even know if like stereotypes are the right word. It's these narratives around specific groups of people, and in this conversation we're talking about autistic people. Is that kind of narrative, and I think that kind of play on that narrative. I was fortunate to watch your just the very small video you have on your website about with regards to your non-autistic brother, you know, and just flipping that narrative on its head, that actually, you know, the way in sometimes we talk about, or the way in which we describe autistic people is very othering. And actually when you know, put that on its head and talk about non-autistic people in that context, it's, you know, it's verging on the ridiculous at times, isn't it? And I think that's the bit that we really need to do that piece of work around, isn't it? It's actually, you know, why are we othering this group of people? And sort of, we were talking before, weren't we, about, you know, the Edinburgh Fringe, for example, you know, says, oh, we've got a relaxed performance, but what does that mean, and who is that for? Because not everybody wants to go into a space where, you know, the lights are turned up, there's no loud noises. That helps some people, it's great, but, you know, not everybody will want that experience. As you say, some people will want that really lovely live comedic experience but don't want to go to a museum. You know, it's kind of, it's expanding those narratives, isn't it, a little bit?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so I think there's probably quite a bit of work to do there in terms of you know, our knowledge and understanding. And we're just going to say hi to Craig. Craig's joined us this afternoon. So hi, Craig. You know, thanks for joining us. So just on that, you know, say we were chatting just before we came on about, you know, the kind of word accessibility, you know, when it comes to, you know, not only things like the Fringe, you know, there's lots and lots of, you know, public events and things like that. And there certainly feels to us that there's been a movement towards actually considering accessibility and what does that mean. But, you know, what's been your experience of that, you know, because we can see, you know, travel up and down the UK, you know, with your tours, you know, what is accessibility like? You know, what's the kind of feeling out there around that? Is it working?
Well, to be honest, the way to see comedy shows accessibly is to become a comedian, because we get our own separate room that's quiet, and you know, I can sit with a few people and talk to them. You know, then go out and I can watch the show from the back, and you know, no one's forcing me where to sit, and you know, it's an interesting thing where you know, I think if you're a performer, accessibility in some ways, I think this isn't true for all performers, but there are some parts of accessibility where it's then just part of what they do for performers, but for audience members that same sort of flexibility isn't given. Yeah, you know, I think that probably my experience of going to comedy shows is as an autistic person is probably better than some audience members, because for that reason, you know, people are accommodating. I think there's loads of things which as I was saying before, you know, there's just loads of easy wins, I think, for accessibility. I think, like, there are obviously some things where we need funding and we need, you know, proper sort of training and big things. Mm-hmm. But I think things like, a small thing which I've been doing in my show is when people come in, other shows will sometimes say, everyone fill in from the front, everyone fill into the end of the rows. And I've been trying to say, sit where you feel comfortable, but ideally near the front at the end of the rows. And I've been trying to do things like that because I know my partner and I have friends as well who will enjoy a show so much more if they're able to sit on the end of an aisle and they can go out to the toilet if they need to, you know. So mm-hmm. I think just things like that, which, you know, is so easy to do. Like, it's absolutely no sort of it makes no difference to me at all, just slightly changing the words I use. But I think doing those sorts of things can help. So there are some easy wins, but also, you know, there are some big things where it would be good if we could properly sort of explore how accessible we can make performances and that sort of thing. So there's also big things as well.
Yeah, I think it's, you know, it's sometimes those little things that, you know, as you described there, that the ones that actually make the real difference. You know, to be able to, you know, sit in a seat, which, let's be honest, a lot of us neurotypicals take for granted, that we'll be able to sit in a seat that we choose, of our choosing, and feel comfortable, etc. You know, so just those kind of small things that are actually just about, it's not even about, you know, because, you know, you've told us you're autistic, it's actually just because we care. You know, it's just the right human thing to do is to
Yeah, and I think that's another thing. I think it's really important that, because I was always autistic, but I only was like officially autistic for 4 years. So I think that all these accessibility things, I think it's important that they are that they are open to everyone. Because I think it's good. Yeah, it's good. Not to me, it feels like there's no point in sort of gatekeeping accessibility stuff. I think it should be for people who need it rather than for autistic people or for
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, though, isn't it? It's not necessarily about sort of picking out specific groups, and actually a lot of the time the kind of support or flexibility, for want of a better phrase, that you might put in place for that small group of people actually, in turn make the whole experience more pleasant for a lot of people, because who doesn't want to sit somewhere that's comfortable and that you feel safe and that you can be your authentic self in that space.
Yeah.
Just picking up a comment here from Ross saying, sitting on the edge of an aisle is a huge thing for me. When I'm going to see a performance or whatever it might be. I'm so glad to hear an autistic performer mention and notice this, because actually that, I think what Ross is saying there, that one thing can be make or break.
Well, thank you, but also it is such an easy thing to do, and like I think it is. There are many things which are just sort of like, I think when I used to work in SEND, which I'm aware is a complicated term, but that's what it's called. When I worked in SEND, there were lots of things in schools where it was sort of like, it'd be like schools worried because there's a child that doesn't want to wear shoes in class. It's like, well, just don't let them not wear shoes. Like I think there's a lot of things which are like, make a difference, but also like incredibly easy to accommodate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and saying they're easy to do, but sometimes quite often have the biggest impact. It's the things that we are hard to do sometimes have the less impact. We can all you mentioned training there. Connecting people with knowledge so they can understand is hugely important, but actually the bit that's the most important on that is actually how they then use that knowledge.
I found from working in SEND, I feel like the biggest thing is like sort of like just cultural attitude of like a school or any or your health service or whatever. A lot of it's like the sort of like, there will be schools that have a really good culture of like inclusion or whatever, of like where the attitude of that school is one where people are able to be themselves, blah blah blah. And I think often that matters way more than like whatever training courses people have been on. It tends to be sort of I suppose it's sometimes hard to change that culture when there is one that isn't good. But I think that if someone's attitude is, treating people as individuals and all those sorts of things which we know are good, that sort of, in a way, matters more than a lot of other sort of, other things.
Mm-hmm. And we've got a lot of love for the point around shoes here. So Christopher saying, my son hates wearing shoes indoors anywhere. Well, Christopher, on he goes, as long as there's, obviously not paved with glass or anything like that, it is, when you sort of think about that out of the context, you think, well, doesn't like wearing shoes, super uncomfortable, not able to focus, well, take the shoes off. Like, it sounds very simple, but you'd be surprised how
it's another one. There's a few comedians who don't wear shoes on stage because they tried doing it and they just found they like not wearing shoes on stage. I mean, it's always accommodated for, that like if you're a performer, people are like, yeah, don't wear your shoes on stage. But I think we need those same accommodations for everyone.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we're coming to sort of the end of our time together, and you are very busy and probably looking for a bit of downtime after your performance this afternoon. So I suppose how can we come and see you? How can we keep in touch with what you're doing? And how can people learn more and know where you might be performing over the next few months if they want to come along and see you?
Yeah, so the show is every day till Sunday at the Edinburgh Fringe. It's at the Banshee Lambert for midday. It's on the free Fringe. There's a placeholder system, so if you get there early and go to the bar, they give you like a free placeholder, so you can guarantee getting in. I'm going to be touring the show a bit around the UK. I'm just booking in dates now, so if you follow me on social media, you'll find them. Yeah, I'm doing a Connect Festival as well if anyone's there at the weekend, so I'll be there.
Great. So keep an eye on Joe's social media pages, and I believe you've got a website as well, Joe.
Yes, which I need to update, so the lists are probably wrong on there. But it's joewells.org.uk.
Great. So people can keep in touch there. So thank you so much, Joe. I, for one, found our conversation this afternoon really interesting. And hopefully our audience out there found it interesting as well, and for lots of really great comments. So thank you to everybody who's posted a question. If we haven't had a chance to get to your question, don't worry, somebody will be in touch with a response to you. So we see you, it's just we haven't had a chance to catch everything this afternoon, so we will be back in touch with you with an answer to your question. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us, and once again, thank you, Joel, for joining us. And we wish you all the best of luck with the rest of your shows. And yeah, anybody who is around in the Fringe over the next few days, and you can, do stop in and get that placeholder for Joel's show, because it's very, very funny. You will have a great time. So thanks, everybody, and we'll see you on the next live event.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.